Introduction. Immerse yourself in the fascinating life of a true American hero. Each era has given humanity geniuses who have fundamentally changed the way people think about life. Henry Ford revolutionized the industry, Albert Einstein made a revolution in physics, Ted Turner created modern media. Franklin has changed society in several areas at once. Franklin enriched science with electrical discoveries. He was one of the American press's pioneers. But the most important thing in his life was building the political foundations of the United States of America. You will experience this man's amazing life, tracing his path from birth to becoming the most famous political figure in American history. If you dream of turning the world around, you'll learn a lot from Franklin. Experience keeps a dear school, but fools learn in no other. Benjamin Franklin. In the following insights you'll find out why in Franklin's time wearing a leather apron meant being a philosopher, how a kite helped Franklin become famous all over the world, who really was a witty writer Mrs. Silence Dogood. Insight 1. A rebel by nature, Benjamin Franklin was very clever, although he only went to school for 2 years. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on January 17, 1705. In his youth, Franklin was already both independent and inventive. When he learned to swim, he realized that the small size of his fingers and toes hampered his speed. To solve this problem, he invented shoulder blades for hands and flippers for feet to move faster in the water. Parents dreamed that Benjamin would get a good education, take holy orders, and devote himself to the church. But Josiah, his father, quickly realized that his son was not fit for it. There were many stories of Benjamin being a naughty child. For example, Franklin always thought that the prayers his father said before each meal were exhausting. So one day, he asked him to pray over all the meat prepared for winter to save time. Franklin spent only 2 years at a local school where he learned writing and arithmetic. At the age of 10, he began working as an apprentice to his father. He then joined his older brother James, who founded the first independent newspaper in Boston, New England Current. After all, Franklin's tired of working as a subordinate. Moreover, during the trips to England, James left all the work to Benjamin, and he successfully managed it. Nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 2. Fate brought Franklin to London and forced him back to America. But he dreamed of a career as a writer. In 1723, when Franklin was barely 17, he went to Philadelphia. That's where he started working at Samuel Keimer's print shop. Franklin thought he was a weirdo, but he enjoyed a lot of fascinating philosophical conversations with Keimer. It was then that Franklin honed the skills of proper debate, which later will be necessary for him. The governor of Pennsylvania, Sir William Keith, favored Franklin, so he had the opportunity to go to London very soon. Franklin worked there for almost 2 years as an assistant to the printing house. But as soon as he was offered a job as a clerk in a Philadelphia store, Franklin was happy to grab the opportunity to return to America. His business was going up fast. But his real passion was literature. From early childhood, Franklin knew that he wanted to become a writer. He read aloud while working at his brother's printing house. He was particularly influenced by John Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim's Progress. And the main idea of the novel, the desire for progress and self-improvement, became his motto for life. He had a favorite book, An Essay Upon Projects, by Daniel Defoe, which Defoe argued that it is simply inhumane to prohibit women from receiving education and equal rights with men. To hone his writing skills, Franklin began reading the British daily newspaper, The Spectator, regularly. He selected the most interesting essays for him, tried to rewrite them in his own words, and then compared his work with the original. Franklin published his first experiments in literature in his brother's newspaper under the pseudonym, Mrs. Silence Dogood. These were humorous essays in which the young Franklin showed an extraordinary imagination. Read much, but not too many books. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 3. Franklin creates a group of like-minded people and begins to implement his ideas for a just society and a new government. Franklin didn't work long as a salesman and soon returned to his old job at Samuel Keimer's printing house. Ambitions kept him from sitting around. In 1727 he founded a club called Leather Aprons Club, later renamed Junta. Junta members, young traders and artisans, met to discuss current events. Franklin's ideas were discussed here. He proposed creating public libraries, setting a tax on the salaries of constables patrolling the neighborhood, making a volunteer fire service, and creating an academy that would later become the University of Pennsylvania. Franklin's thoughts about government and security were radical at that time. In 1747, he conceived a volunteer police force independent of the Pennsylvania colonial government. He believed that such a corps was necessary because the government underestimated the military threat from France and its allies among the Indian tribes. Around 10,000 people joined the volunteer police corps and tried to elect Franklin a colonel, but he refused it. Instead, Franklin wrote the corps motto and developed insignia for his units. But in 1748, the threat of war disappeared, and the corps collapsed. Perhaps Franklin did not fully understand how radical the idea of transferring parts of government functions to a group of individuals was. Colonel Thomas Penn condemned Franklin's actions, saw in his actions contempt for the colonial government, and declared Franklin a dangerous man. In those years, Franklin was not too busy with politics, until his real struggle for power remained as long as 20 years. In the meantime, Franklin was fascinated by the natural sciences. In Rivers and Bad Governments, the easiest thing comes up. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 4. Franklin's curiosity has led to serious scientific discoveries in the field of electricity. During a trip to Boston in 1743, Franklin attended an entertainment show where he first saw tricks with electricity. In those days, no one understood how it worked. Intrigued by what he saw, Franklin started his experiments. He soon discovered a connection between electricity and lightning. He conceived an experiment in which he was going to put a man with an iron rod in his hands on top of a hill during a thunderstorm to attract a lightning strike. The experiment had to prove that a metal object attracts an electric charge and that lightning is electric. Franklin described his ambitious hypothesis in a letter to the Royal Society of London. Franklin's idea quickly spread to the academic world. And already in May 1752, a group of French researchers managed to implement the Franklin experiment successfully. Meanwhile, Franklin decided to conduct the experiment himself, using not a rod, but a metal key attached to the kite rope. Launching the kite in a storm, Franklin proved that he was right in his expectations. The key was struck by lightning. Then he managed to transfer the charge from the key to the first electric capacitor, a special glass jar, which stored the electricity. It was called a Leyden jar. Franklin's discovery led to his invention of the lightning rod. Further research into electricity has brought Franklin even more recognition. For example, he invented the term battery to refer to charged Leyden jars. Franklin came across a conviction, too. First of all, from the church. Abbot Nalle called his research a crime before God. In response to these attacks, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant called Franklin the new Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. Despite this, the star of Franklin was rising. He was awarded the honorary degrees of Harvard and Yale. Insight 5. Franklin has developed an initial plan to unite the American colonies. However, the time for an alliance has not yet come. With his success in science, Franklin turned his attention to politics. But it was more dangerous than lightning experiments. In 1753, the colonies' relations with France were sharply escalated by control of the Ohio Valley. While George Washington tried unsuccessfully to expel the French from those territories, the British colonial authorities invited delegates from each colony to a congress in Albany to discuss how to confront the enemy jointly. Franklin, along with a wealthy merchant from Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, drew up a plan to form the Union of Colonies, which he planned to present in Albany. The colonies found the idea of cooperation hostile. In 1751, in a letter to his friend James Parker, Franklin wrote, "It would be an extraordinary thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages, Iroquois, should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and yet that a like union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies, to whom it is more necessary." Franklin's plan for a unified government called for an elected body, a national Congress. The Congress was to include representatives of all colonies. Franklin also proposed to introduce the post of general president, who would be appointed by the king. This new political idea for its time will later form the basis of federalism. The central government will deal with issues of national defense and the extension of borders to the west. At the same time, its power and laws will govern each colony. But Franklin's plan was rejected. The colonial authorities considered it an infringement on their authority. And in England, according to Franklin, the plan was called too democratic. At the time, Franklin was skeptical of those at the head of the colonies. Still, he recognized Britain's power over American colonies. But very soon, his opinion changed. Time as money. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 6. Franklin started struggling for the rights of the colonies in Britain, but could not force the owners to give up their power. The Assembly again raised the question of the colonies' dependency on Britain in Pennsylvania in 1757, 3 years after the Albany Congress. Franklin went to London to influence influential British families who owned the colonies and force them to vote for a common colonial government. In case of failure, he was prepared to address the British government directly. It took 5 years to negotiate with these families. First, Franklin met with Pennsylvania's owner, Thomas Penn. Penn, on behalf of all owners of the colonies, demanded that they be exempt from taxes that protected colonial lands from the combined forces of the French and their Indian allies. Franklin considered such demands unfair and cruel. On behalf of the Assembly, Franklin sent Penn an official note condemning the colony owners' demands. Moreover, Franklin even refused to observe decency, did not use the required treatment of Penn as true and absolute owners, and did not address the document to Penn personally. A serious disagreement over the power followed this. The Assembly chose a group of commissioners to negotiate with the Indians, but Thomas Penn exercised his right to veto the decision. Franklin objected, saying that the previous owner of the colony, Father Thomas Penn, William, gave the Assembly similar powers in the Charter of Privileges of 1701. Thomas Penn responded by cutting off negotiations. It took them a year to get their relationship back on track. Penn was convinced that the Pennsylvania Assembly could only be an advisory body, giving advice and consent, but nothing more. Franklin realized that now it was pointless to try to change the mindset of the colonial masters. Franklin's frustration was great. Franklin, however, continued to speak out on the issue of colony rights wherever he had been. In London, he met with leading English educators, including the philosopher David Hume. Communicating with him only strengthened Franklin's beliefs. In 1762, Franklin returned to America and found that the political situation there had deteriorated considerably. To be satisfied with your position, you must compare it to the worst. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 7. The Coat of Arms Act was the last straw for the colonies. Only a war with Britain could resolve the conflict. Franklin was shocked by what he saw in Philadelphia. Relations between the colonial inhabitants and the Indians had deteriorated. The border guards, who were called Paxton Boys, threatened to kill all the Indians and those who sympathized with them. Obviously, the official government could not cope with the situation, so Franklin went back to London. This time he spent 10 years there. In 1765, after Franklin sailed to England, the British proposed stamp duty law, a tax on all printed materials produced in the colonies, which went to fund the fighting against the French and Indians. The stamp duty law fundamentally changed the lives of the colonies and the political career of Franklin. The tax was the last straw for the inhabitants of the colonies. New colonial leaders appeared, and Thomas Jefferson, the future President of the United States, stood out. These leaders began to advocate the overthrow of the British power. At first, Franklin supported the stamp duty law as a necessary and pragmatic step. In response, a crowd of disgruntled people stormed Franklin's house in Philadelphia. At that time, only his wife was there. Having barricaded herself and armed herself with a rifle, this brave woman was able to resist the crowd. Realizing how much the mood in the colonies had changed, Franklin changed his mind about stamp duty. At the same time, he began to support the struggle for independence of the colonies from Britain. Either the British Parliament passes a law on independence, or war is coming. There could be no compromise. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1775, people welcomed him as a patriot. Where there is hunger, law is not regarded, and where law is not regarded, there will be hunger. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 8. Franklin's writings began a movement to separate the colonies from Britain and eventually led to the Declaration of Independence. Franklin understood that the colonies needed to unite in the struggle for independence from Britain. July 21, 1775, Franklin spoke at the Continental Congress, which was convened by activists against British rule. Franklin presented his draft article on the Confederation and the Perpetual Union. He proposed to form a unicameral Congress, in which deputies from all colonies would be represented in proportion to the population. Congress had great powers. The president was replaced by an executive council of 12 members elected by Congress. Franklin still was hoping that Britain would yield to the colonies, give them independence, and pay monetary compensation. In that case, the Confederation would be dissolved. Like many colonial leaders, Franklin saw the crisis with Britain as enmity with specific British government ministers, not with the Crown itself. But in 1776, a pamphlet appeared in the press, a journalistic work against the political system. This pamphlet provoked the rise of the struggle for independence in the colonies. The pamphlet, Common Sense, was written by Thomas Paine, although many thought that the author was Franklin. Moreover, Franklin read it before publication and suggested some changes. Paine furiously advocated complete independence of the colonies from Britain, proving that there was no natural or religious basis for dividing people into kings or subjects. The brochure has a circulation of more than 120,000 copies. An incredible amount for this time. It helped to unite revolutionary forces in the fight against colonial rule. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress voted for American independence. Thomas Jefferson eventually wrote the Declaration of Independence and asked Franklin to amend the finished document. The phrase became most famous, "We consider these truths sacred and undeniable." In Franklin's version, it looks like this: "We consider these truths self-evident." Franklin believed that all men are equal from nature. To God, all men are the same, and he does not give special rights to only the chosen ones. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 9. Franklin managed to persuade France to be an ally in the fight against Britain. With the Declaration of Independence from Britain, 13 colonies of America faced a formidable enemy. The colonies needed an ally to have a chance to win the war. And they turned to their former enemies, the French. But who could have persuaded the French to support the rebellious colonies? Of course, Benjamin Franklin. The success of the American Revolution was now in his hands. Nothing was impossible for Franklin. At the end of 1776, he went to Paris to meet with the French foreign minister, Count of Vergennes. In a conversation with Vergennes, Franklin pointed to the fragile balance of power between the new, independent American state, England, and France. Franklin realized that Vergennes was looking at the alliance with America quite favorably. If France supports the Americans, it will inevitably lead Britain to defeat and lose its American colonies and possessions in the West Indies. In case of victory, Franklin promised to keep the West Indies islands for France. But if France refused to help, the Americans would be forced to take into account Britain's interests, which would cause deep contradictions with France's interests. In the end, Vergennes agreed to support America. Still, the French pulled an official response, and only in March 1778, Louis XVI signed the agreement. When it happened, crowds gathered at the royal palace's gates to see a famous American who was met shouting, "Long live Franklin!" But Franklin was on his way to America. The alliance he managed to make gave the Americans a chance to defeat the British. To be humble with your superiors is a duty, with your peers a courtesy, with your inferiors a nobility. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 10. After the War of Independence, Franklin's diplomatic talent once again saved America. After the end of hostilities, it's time to build a relationship with Britain. Once again, Franklin's practical mind and experience were in demand. At the beginning of the war, Franklin believed America should not seek help from other countries. However, he later changed his position and emphasized how grateful America was to France for its support. This position has broken the friendship between Franklin and John Adams. Adams claimed that the French had made this alliance solely out of their interests. So America, in his deep conviction, owed France nothing. But by the end of the 1770s, America began to need money so badly to continue the war that the importance of relations with France was no longer in doubt. Without sufficient financial support, Americans could not have won, and without a victory, Britain would not have started negotiations. Franklin negotiated with the French again, and America received financial support. The war went on. In 1781, the British General Lord Cornwallis was defeated in Yorktown, Virginia. This victory was a key victory in the struggle for independence. Peace talks began with the British. And then Franklin, as one of the peacekeepers, faced a new challenge. Earlier, America promised the French joint participation in negotiations, but British representatives insisted on meeting with the Americans separately. Franklin faced a rather risky enterprise. He regularly met with British representatives, secretly from the French. He suggested that the British hand over control of Canada to America. It would make America strong and less dependent on France, which would inevitably cause a negative reaction. On November 30, 1782, a peace treaty was signed that recognized America as a free, sovereign, and independent state. This statement outraged France, who knew nothing about negotiations behind its back. But Franklin's diplomatic skills played their part again. He reassured Vergennes, but he was able to convince him that America was still loyal to France's alliance. Whatever the situation people are in, they can always find convenience and inconvenience. Benjamin Franklin. Insight 11. Franklin has gone down in American history forever as the author of the American Constitution and national hero. When news of the British defeat reached Congress in 1781, there was so little money in the Treasury that Congress members had to pay the envoy from their own pockets. According to the Articles of the Confederation, Congress had insufficient authority to collect taxes. Now that the war was over, the state needed change. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention was adopted, in the drafting of which Franklin participated. The question of representation of former colonies in Congress was one of the key concerns of the convention. Franklin noted that with proportional representation, where the number of deputies depends on the population, small states would have little or no vote. And with an equal number of votes from each state, large states would have to share their money with everyone. That's why Franklin suggested making Congress bicameral. Representatives of the lower house were to be elected in proportion to the population. The upper house was to consist of an equal number of senators from each state. The lower house, the House of Representatives, was to regulate taxes and expenses. The upper house, the Senate, approved executive officials and considered any questions about the sovereignty of the state. Eventually, Franklin's proposal was accepted. But his involvement in political life didn't end there. His last mission was the fight against slavery. Franklin's view of slavery changed over time. He always condemned it but believed that the time for its abolition had not come. In 1787, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. In 1760, approximately 10% of Philadelphia residents were slaves. In 1790, Franklin filed a petition to Congress, stating that it was his duty to defend freedom for the American people, without distinction as to skin color. But despite Franklin's best efforts, his petition was condemned. Benjamin Franklin died in April 17, 1790, in Philadelphia at the age of 84. Over 20,000 people came to say goodbye to him. The entire population of the city, including infants, was 33,000 at the time. In his youth, Franklin burst into the political arena. He remained an active public figure and a successful politician until his death. Franklin will forever remain in American history as an outstanding statesman. I will not refuse to live my life again from beginning to end. I will only ask for the rights enjoyed by the authors to correct the errors of the first edition. Benjamin Franklin. Conclusion. Main idea. The life of Benjamin Franklin is a vivid example of how one man, with his boundless curiosity and sincere interest in people, progress, and freedom, can change the course of history.